Well, the worst, at least for today, may be over with the Dow Jones Industrial Average. As I mentioned earlier, it's only an average of 30 stocks, 30 big stocks, and those change periodically. Some have been delisted, others that have grown, companies that grow large get put on that list. But you have a list of 2,000 stocks, and then you have another that's a list of 5,000 stocks. Friends of mine tell me that's what you should be watching because the larger the average is when it comes to various stocks that are being traded, you get a better picture of what's going on around the world. Right now, the last I looked, I think the Dow is down 417. Some of the other indexes are all down as well. I mean, if you take a look at any of them, and all around the world, there are a lot of problems going on. And this is the meltdown in China that is really having an impact on all of this. Long term, who knows? But I think it bodes well, it means that the economy worldwide is slowing, and that means there are going to be repercussions no matter what you see or what you have. And then there was going to be, I think, scheduled next month, a rate increase from the Federal Reserve. That may not happen as well, which means if the economy is in such great shape, as a friend of mine likes to tell me, why have we seen interest rates that have essentially been zero now for close to a decade? That should tell you something. The patient is not well. 8 minutes after 9 o'clock. 59. Bill Colley with you on Top Story. An old friend of mine, I used to know him from days we were with a press club. We were officers with a press club in a city far, far away. He was telling me, he said that the stimulus is what kept us out of depression. Well, I don't know about that. And he's an Obama guy. I mean, he voted for Obama, a fellow person of color, just like a lot of people in 1960 voted for John Kennedy because he had Irish ancestry or he was Roman Catholic. But I don't think people are really looking at the big picture when they do that. The stimulus package is a little bit like taking cold medicine. We can't cure a common cold. Dr. Tripp was in studio with us last Wednesday and made that clear. I think we're all aware of that. But what cold medicines often do is they lessen the symptoms. Although a doctor told me some years ago that you lessen the symptoms, but you stretch out the cold. In other words, a cold that might be gone in a week may linger 10 days. Your symptoms won't be as great, but you're putting off the end of it. The stimulus package was essentially something that made that cold a little bit more mild, but it stretched out the cold, which we still seem to be in at this point, and there's no more cough medicine left. I have a couple of things I wanted to share with you. While we're going through all of this around the world, it makes you wonder, are people then taking all of this seriously? I have this piece from Fox News. Some deeply offended people are demanding a school change its nickname. Jeff Manasso, the reporter for Fox. Yes, as the world is potentially on the verge of meltdown, we have more weighty things to talk about. Listen for a moment.
A group representing people with dwarfism, along with some community members in Freeburg in southern Illinois, are once again asking high school leaders there to drop a Midgets nickname that they call offensive. Freeburg high school leaders agreed to keep the name and mascot last month that's been the subject of criticism by the Little People of America, the group that's trying to get Freeburg and about a half dozen other schools nationwide to drop the moniker. Supporters say the name was coined nearly 100 years ago, calling it a source of community pride and a tradition for the small town. In Chicago, Jeff Manasso, Fox News Radio.
Yep. My feelings are hurt because your team is called the Midgets. When I was a kid, we played Pop Warner football, but in my hometown it was not called Pop. But the league I was in, we had two counties, Allegheny and Cattaraugus, so we were called the Alley Cat Football League. They hyphenated the name and shortened the names of the two counties. Number one, that was strange enough. Number two, we were called Midgets. It was midget football. It was not called Pop Warner, although it was Pop Warner. And you could enroll your kid in Pee Wee when he was really young, and then in pony football, and then in midget football. Then your kid would go off and play either JV or high school football. And that was the progression that you did. And then we had Little League Baseball, and all of the Little League teams in town, there were 6, were all named after big league teams. But they decided they needed a developmental league for even younger kids. So they created a developmental league that had just 2 teams. Well, really big town, you know. And they were the Podunk Pumpkins. No pumpkins were offended, by the way, in the naming of that team. And then the second team was known as the Mud Alley Midgets. I never once heard somebody say, and in fact, my neighbor Dave Gaeta, he played for the Mud Alley Midgets. His older sister was married to a dwarf. I never heard Dave's uncle complain that his feelings were hurt because Dave was playing for a team called the Midgets. In fact, I don't think the uncle ever assumed that anyone, when they came up with a name, was thinking of him. But otherwise, he was a normal guy, right? He didn't take offense at it. Everybody has to be so dang deeply offended by any. And this is why Donald Trump is such a breath of fresh air. Whether or not you like him, whether or not you think he's good for America, the reason that people like that are getting some traction is because everybody, everywhere, is so fed up with this BS. 12 minutes after 9 o'clock. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. We have a caller with us, and you're on the air.
Yeah, I am terribly offended by the homosexuals hijacking the word gay and stealing God's rainbow for their symbol.
Well, sometimes it rains over that rainbow, too, atop their heads, I guess. I thank you. Is that called golden shower? No, that's a topic for another day. That's the greatest unplanned segue that I've ever had in radio. Sean Fitzpatrick, writing today at Crisis Magazine, the headline, "When a Man Calls Himself a Chicken." The writer says this cultural stance of endorsing people who are, quote, questioning, unquote, or, quote, transitioning, unquote, their very essence, however, is not a stance at all, but rather a stumbling, the less people are able to identify insanity. Ooh. It used to be said that, if you couldn't figure out if you were a girl or a boy, you were having some issues with that, or you had attractions that were not opposite sex attractions, that you were plain nuts. And then what happened was a lot of these psychiatrists who were making the designations, they got pressured by friends who said, that hurts my feelings, so they changed the definition. And then newspapers went out, and it was all part of the homosexual agenda. The newspapers hired, dozens and dozens of these people to staff the editorial desks, so you could go out and tell the public it was mean-spirited, and no, these people weren't nuts. So you can't go around calling them kooky, loony, or bats, because it might hurt their feelings. The writer goes on to say, if he calls himself a woman, but if a man calls himself a chicken, he is crazy. So you can call yourself a woman like Bruce Lynn Jenner, but if Bruce Lynn tomorrow decides suddenly he's a chicken, then we'll say that he's lost his mind. But if he says he's a woman, we don't do that. Why is that? The writer goes on to say, if a man can have the courage to be a woman that he thinks he is, even without the anatomy or nature of a woman, what precisely is stopping him from having the courage to be the chicken that he thinks he is? People applaud those who surrender to their delusions concerning self-identity. Liberalism has already legally redefined what constitutes man, woman, human being, and a disorder. Why should it refuse anyone who thinks that they happen to be a chicken, if that is the soul they were born with? So if your neighbor is out there someday, you go driving by the neighbor's house, and the neighbor's out there, and he's eating all the seeds from the front yard, you know that there's nothing wrong with that. We just got to be assured of that, because if he thinks he's a chicken, well, then by golly, he's a chicken. Although, come barbecue night, he should stay away from your home. 9:15, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. What you've done is you've had these people in their Alinskyite Frankfurt School fashion. They've come in and told you that, the sky is the ocean and the ocean is the sky. And if you argue with it, they scream bigot or they scream racist or homophobe, whatever it happens to be, and they just try and shout you down. And since they now control media and entertainment, they can amplify that. And they can tell you that it's wrong to oppose this country being overrun by masses of the poor from south of our border, things along those lines. And now they wonder why people are so dang angry? Doesn't surprise me. 9:16. You can reach our program this morning. You can dial me up, Bill Colley on Top Story, at News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. That telephone number is 736-0300, 736-0300. And, of course, you can always drop me an email at bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. That's bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. If there had been a vigil by homosexuals outside any building in town Saturday, it would have been the lead story yesterday at the Magic Valley Times-News. I'm not kidding you. It would have been. And even if there had only been 6 of them who were there having a vigil outside any building in town, they would have taken a camera angle to give you the impression they were perhaps a couple of hundred. And they would be called courageous for making a stand. And we would be told that it's just an alternative lifestyle and that anyone who thinks otherwise, they're the crazy ones now. But the fact of the matter is you had a couple of hundred people Saturday who were holding a vigil outside Planned Parenthood in Twin Falls. And no one bothered to come report on it. Why? Well, they were praying. I suppose if you're a newspaper reporter, it's a bit like the Wicked Witch of the West. You know, you show up and if you suddenly, somebody might even be carrying holy water, and if you get splashed with it, I'm melting, and then you'll just simply, be gone, and there won't be anyone to report on that story that day. I do tend to believe that when they make these decisions, that they're not making them any longer about what's most newsworthy. They're making these decisions simply based on whatever the editor wants. This is not a good business model. When I got into the radio business, and I have some experience as well in newspapering and television, but I had an operations manager at a radio station that I worked at in about 1989, 1990. I did a couple of radio jobs before that, but the first really serious radio operation that I worked for. And he used to tell us, we have to be audience-oriented. And I would say, what do you mean by that? He said, well, you may see a story on the street, and you are hugely, hugely concerned about it, but you may be all alone. We used to notice that if we would do stories about common council meetings, you could do a story about a common council meeting, or as a buddy of mine once said in the newsroom, if you said the word state controller, he said you immediately forced people to turn the dial, or you put them to sleep. We would never get any reaction to those stories. But if we did a reaction about a new heart procedure, you'd finish the newscast, you'd walk out into the newsroom, and there would be telephone calls coming in from people who had heard it and they wanted to know more. Why? Because everyone knows somebody else who has heart disease, whether they be in your family or at work, somebody you know from church. And they wanted to know more about this because it was important to them, because it might work for their neighbor, their friend, or their family member, and perhaps save a life. And the council meeting, talking about dumping ping pong balls down into the sewers so they could do some measurements, was about the most boring thing you could tell people about. 20 minutes after 9 o'clock. So, if you make a decision that you're not going to cover the Planned Parenthood vigil, the prayer vigil, because those evil Christians are over there again, trying to prevent the butchering of babies, and we don't want to report on that, you're not going to sell many newspapers in a valley that is just chock full of Christians. Again, it's a terrible business model. But if your goal is to put yourself out of business, you're well on the way. Bill Colley with you this morning on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX, newsradio1310.com. Oh, couple of environmental whack job stories on the way a little later in the program. If we get an opportunity, I want to talk about that. Also, Donald Trump as well.